Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for joining the first of a series of podcasts by both the Alex Group and by Richard Moore Solutions. The purpose of these podcasts is to determine the challenges of apprenticeships, and we have a number of experts in the field for these discussions. The first of which, representing the Alex Group, we have Bally and George, and from Richard Moore Solutions, we have Richard Moore. In the first instance, Bally, could you briefly introduce yourself and describe your role?
Hi, Vinh. Yes, thanks. My name's Bally Bhogal. I'm from Alex Group. My background is from the apprenticeship sector, sort of funded learning sector. I've been a deliverer of apprenticeships. I've mobilised contracts. I've worked in the governance and sort of leadership teams within apprenticeship training providers. And now we work here as auditors, trainers and consultants to the sector.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Bally. George, if you'd like to introduce yourself, please.
Good afternoon, Vin, and thank you for the invitation. My name is George Kakaire, and for my sins, I've been involved within the sector in the last 27 years in a number of guises, as a learner, as an assessor, trainer, manager, and in latter years also undertaken business advice. So for my sins, I think I've got the T-shirt and the scars to prove it, and I hope that I will be able to sort of share some of my experiences to that respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George, and I can definitely say that you have very much earned the T-shirt in your field. Richard, if you'd like to give us a brief description of your role, please.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you very much, Vin. Hello, yes, my name is Richard Moore. For the purposes of today's podcast, my background is really as a full-time Ofsted HMI, which of course is now His Majesty's Inspector rather than Her Majesty's Inspector as it used to be for a number of years, preceded by being an inspector for an organisation called the Adult Learning Inspectorate, who used to be responsible for inspecting apprenticeships and other work-based learning prior to being merged with Ofsted. I was also a manager in Ofsted, so I used to manage a team of HMI who undertook schools and further education and schools inspections. And for the last number of years, I've been running my own further education and skills consultancy, focusing in on quality, curriculum, and preparing providers for Ofsted inspections. And I'm also a governor of a big college group, and also sit on the board of a number of training and employer providers.
Absolutely fantastic, Richard. Thank you so much. If there was anyone in any doubt of the credentials of the three experts gathered here, may they doubt no longer. Moving forward, like I said, the purposes of these podcasts was to pretty much narrow down exactly what the challenges are in apprenticeships. I asked both Bally, George and Richard to determine the different areas in which apprenticeships present the most challenges, to narrow down the different subjects and whatnot. And they've come up with a long list of challenges which in their many years within the sector, the biggest challenges that they've encountered, and quite possibly the challenges which require the most attention. We'll start off with what Bally has determined as the ever-changing landscape. Bally, could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, thanks, Vin. So for us, we thought about it, and there's a number of areas, and one of those areas was the ever-changing just landscape for apprenticeships, and that relates to pretty much everything regards policy and the politics of apprenticeships. So just this last week we've had the budget. There was no major announcement in the budget around apprenticeships as such. The biggest reform for apprenticeships came back in 2017-18, and that was colossal in terms of changes for the sector. An adjustment from that, I think we still feel some of the the kind of effects of that change still now. But from last week, we've had no major sort of announcements. We've had kind of returnerships. Those have been announced as of last week. So there's, you know, sort of apprenticeships, if you like, for over 50s. There's all sorts of devolution deals going on at local authority levels. So that affects providers, training providers from an apprenticeship and also adult education budget. Just things like contracts, tenders, budgets, you know, just organising your own workforce, and also procurement, and all of these costs a training provider business. All of this creates uncertainty for an apprenticeship training provider business. And we've seen in the past that, you know, apprenticeship starts used to be as high as £500,000 per year, but they have you know, sort of diminished to around sort of the 350,000 mark in 2021 and 22. And those are statistics from Parliament UK. So when we look at this scale and this level of uncertainty, that in itself is really important when we're working with providers, both at sort of business advisory, George would have mentioned business advisory level, but also from a compliance and a quality perspective. All of this affects apprenticeship training provider cost and staff included. So we felt that as a starting point, we felt we had to mention that what's happening in the landscape at the minute from that perspective is really important, and how it affects the inside of an apprenticeship training provider business.
I see. Thank you very much, Bally. George, do you have what are your thoughts on the subject?
I'm probably kind of a mirror of some of the comments made by Bally, but I've kind of identified three themes that I think play themselves out in terms of the funding rules. The first one is obviously political ideology, because we've had a number of politicians who have obviously been involved in decision making around apprenticeships, and sometimes the comments that have been made historically haven't been very helpful in almost consolidating training providers' understanding of where the government is going with this. And on that particular point, I don't think I really need to dwell too much on that one. I think it's self-explanatory. The other area that I sort of think has some impact in relation to the funding rules is the social trends, because we notice that now increasingly, especially apprenticeships among young people, the way young people want to work and live is slightly different from the traditional trend set years ago in terms of people's expectations of how they want to see their world of work and like work-life balance. And I think that in itself kind of presents challenges for providers when clearly the rules are set at policy level, at government level, and yet the people on the receiving side of it kind of have a different mindset to what traditionally has been what used to be perceived in the old days of what you call an apprenticeship, in terms of how they want to work, working patterns against the disciplines of traditional working practices, which then kind of leads to my third point, which is really around the economic cycles. You find that a lot of the rules sometimes are in conflict economically with what is actually happening. For example, I remember a time whereby online learning was almost a taboo in terms of the ESFA thinking. Now, all of a sudden, because of the economic cycle as well as, you know, recent pandemic, you look at the situation and sort of have a slightly skewed view of how these rules are being interpreted in line with what is going on economically and what is really achievable. And that's really my thought process. I hope I haven't really skewed any thinking in any way and given any sort of concrete response to any particular scenario, but that is where my starting point might be.
Thank you, George. You did make a point in regards to the funding rules, and I did want to catch up with that. But I believe the subject of the ever-changing landscape really ties into one of the subjects which Richard brought up, and that was in regards to the landscape. No doubt that far more adaptability and versatility would be required, but inevitably, some learners are going to be catching up on their learning and be falling behind. Richard, would you agree that the two are closely linked at all?
Absolutely, yes, indeed, and that's a very good point, Vin. I work, well, as Bally and George do, with a huge number of providers. I sit on a number of boards. I was only discussing this on my college board yesterday, which I chair curriculum and quality at, and there are almost hundreds of providers out there now with learners who are struggling to complete on time, and it's really down to a number of reasons. And George has hit on something around almost a quite difficult to describe sort of change in working patterns and attitudes to work, which I definitely think is a factor, you know, the sort of working from home as well that has kicked in, and how compatible that is for people who are on certain types of apprenticeships. We've got the impact of COVID, which is still there, because we need to remember that many apprenticeships have a 2-year duration, particularly the higher level apprenticeships, some of them longer than that. So they are still being impacted negatively by COVID. We've had the cost of living crisis. We've got employers who are struggling to recruit new staff and to retain them. And all of those factors, and probably one or two others that I've not mentioned, are really having a very significant impact on apprentices being able to complete their apprenticeship on time. It isn't just about external factors, and I think some providers are a little bit too ready to just blame it on the external landscape. There are internal factors. We've got the difficulties around the functional skills, particularly the level 2 functional skills maths, which a lot of learners need to obtain their apprenticeship. And really, partly because of the factors I've already mentioned, we've got a real tension with learners being released for their off-the-job training by employers who are very short-staffed. So these learners are not getting the correct amount of time to complete their coursework. That means they fall behind with their apprenticeship. They fall behind with any qualifications such as a diploma that sits within the apprenticeship. And these factors all come together to mean that we've now got nationally a significant proportion of learners who are past their planned end date. They're unable to go forward into gateway and to endpoint assessment. And providers are really struggling with monitoring these learners and getting them to a point where they are able to complete their apprenticeship successfully. It's something that Ofsted have very much picked up on, and they are now very tuned in to talking to providers on inspection about learners who are past their planned end date or are significantly behind with their progress and at danger of becoming out of funding learners. And I say to all of my providers, you need to have very clear action plans in place to be able to show inspectors regarding what the issues are, so that you can demonstrate your awareness of them, how you're tackling them, and is that resulting in a decline in the number of learners that you've got past planned end date. So this has gone from being, I think, a fairly minor issue for the sector pre-COVID to now being a very significant issue for providers on an ongoing basis, and obviously when they come to be inspected.
Fantastic, Richard. Thank you. George, would you agree? Is there anything you wish to add to that at all?
I think for me, from Richard's perspective, obviously looking at it from a compliance perspective, what is the trend in terms of how the ESFA are looking at this? I mean, Ofsted looking at this in terms of where they need to be in terms of making the allowances that they need to make in relation to obviously the challenges that have been posed by COVID. Is there some sense of leniency in terms of being able, because COVID has affected people and businesses in different ways. So I suspect that there is no uniform way of thinking that you could come up with a strict measure of really doing justice in terms of that kind of regime.
Yeah, and it's an excellent point, George. And the difficulty that Ofsted have as an inspector, and I've faced this difficulty myself, is what is a genuine contextual reason for learners being behind, or any other negative aspect of an apprenticeship. Actually, is it genuinely because of external factors, or do we have, and there is no doubt that this is the case, do we have providers who are hiding behind those external factors when in fact it's the internal quality of their delivery which has led to learners not completing their apprenticeship on time, or indeed at all? And that's an ongoing tension. You can see that in the further education press, where providers who are not doing well at inspection are blaming it on inspectors' lack of knowledge of the context, and inspectors who don't really have a mouthpiece to come back to providers nationally. But if you talk to inspectors, they will say, well, actually, yes, it was a little bit that, but a lot of it was down to the poor teaching and learning and other processes internally within the provider.
I see, Richard. Thank you. Bally, what are your thoughts on this ongoing issue?
Yeah, these everything that George and Richard have just mentioned have just brought everything really nicely into kind of my second point that I wanted to make. So thank you for that, guys. It's the ever-changing funding rules. So you've mentioned about how the context, the environment in which apprenticeship training providers and employers and apprentices are operating affect what really happens on the ground, and how the apprenticeship sort of plays out, and whether they're behind time. But I think this has massive implications for compliance as well. And these ever-changing funding rules that George sort of alluded to, I mean, they've gone from sort of 80 odd pages back in 2017-18 to sort of roughly kind of 150 pages of just prescriptive information in terms of what is required by the Education Skills Funding Agency, compliance requirements that the ESFA want to see in audits, and everything that Richard and George has mentioned. So just falling behind, maybe the progress reviews aren't getting done on time, we just slightly late in picking up on learners fallen behind maybe 3 or 4 weeks, but by the time we put catch-up plans in place, it's 6 weeks, it's 10 weeks, and then before we know it, the learner is beyond their planned end date for learning and completion. So it's all relative. We've seen terminology changes in the funding rules. We've seen progress reviews go from sort of every 8 weeks to 12 weeks now. We've seen just terminology in terms of what is 20% off the job requirements to now minimum 6 hours, and all of this has a massive impact. So not only just delivering the day job to keep learners on track, but also the compliance and all the evidence and evidence trails. And I think George, being an IQA here, he's been party to and has reviewed a lot of documents, as have I, with regards to what do we accept as a well-written individual learning plan, well-articulated progress review, an action plan that is keeping the learner on plan, or indeed helps them to catch up. Has that been signed off by IQAs? Is that helping from a compliance perspective? So it's very much going to help in audits, but also from a quality perspective. Sometimes these changes to the funding rules they just come far too late in the year to be able to do anything about them. And sometimes you get this feeling, and I think Richard hit the nail on the head, we're still feeling the adverse impact of COVID, and it's still playing out. It just has a knock-on effect on providers, and they kind of always seem to be, at the moment, in a lot of cases, majority less so than the minority, on the back foot here. So we think that the ever-changing funding rules really have a massive effect on both quality and compliance.
It seems to me that there's yes, especially due to COVID, there seems to be a requirement for far more adaptability, but how much can we ask of these apprenticeship training providers and of the students themselves? How much can we ask them to adapt, and how versatile do we need them to be, especially in an area of education which is expected to train someone up in a particular specialism, is what I'm wondering. And given everyone's input so far, there seems to be a slow but sure destination here towards outlining what exactly the issue is, and it seems to be quite possibly, and correct me if I'm wrong, there seems to be a lack of consistency in regards to what exactly people need to know from your side, Bally, in regards to the landscape, the funding rules, and George, you mentioned politics and policy and compliance. And Richard, from your side, what exactly are these apprenticeship providers meant to provide? It seems to be that everyone's unsure of the direction that they need to go, and I'm sure that ties into, you know, the exactly how to tailor these training plans, Richard, that you've mentioned, how to determine what skills they can be trained in, and how to move that forward. Richard, would you agree with that?
Yes, I would, and it sort of ties or segues quite nicely into my next point about, you know, the struggles that employers are having in releasing learners for their allocated off-the-job training time, whether that's the old 20% or the new kind of 6 hours minimum per week. And a lot of the reasons, some of the struggles, some of the reasons for that struggle we've already touched on, and they're kind of external reasons. However, that isn't always the case, and employers are often at fault for agreeing to release learners for their allocated off-the-job training time and then actually not doing so. Providers are guilty of not always making that clear to the employer at the outset. So I speak to a lot of employers who, if one takes it at face value, will say that they weren't informed accurately enough of their responsibility and commitment at the outset of the apprenticeship, and didn't realise that the learners were going to have to be released for the equivalent of 6 hours per week over the course of their programme. And where this manifests itself is, you'll see the learners often released for the structured off-the-job training that they do with the training providers. So where they have to attend a workshop, a webinar, a training centre if it's face-to-face, call it what you will, a coaching session, the employer seems to have no problem in releasing them for that formal off-the-job training. But on the other weeks where the learner is not receiving that taught input, if you like, from the training provider, a lot of employers are then very naughty in not releasing the learners for their allocated off-the-job training time. And that means they get behind with assignments, they get behind with any self-study they've got to do, with their administration, etc., etc., etc. And what then happens is they end up having to use their own time out of working hours, particularly at the weekend, to catch up on any work. And I was working with a provider recently that was running apprenticeships for senior leaders, and I won't say in what sort of curriculum area or what context, because that might give away a little bit too much information. But the apprentices were all senior leaders within this employer provider. So it was a provider running apprenticeships for its own staff, and these senior leaders, to a person, were having to do all of their work at the weekends towards their apprenticeships. And it's, if you want to guarantee going down the road of a grade 3 or grade 4 an Ofsted inspection, not releasing the learners for their off-the-job training is a very good start, because Ofsted takes a very dim view of that, but again struggles with this, you know, how much is it down to external factors, how much is it down to internal factors. And training providers often say to me, well, will we get the blame for that when it's the employer's fault that they're not being released? And sadly, whether one likes it or not, yes, it will be the training provider who will cop it, if you like, to use a bit of colloquial language, and the grade 3 or grade 4 will be at the top of their inspection report with their name on it, and it won't be the employer's name that is really anywhere in that inspection report, and certainly not at the top of it.
I see, and it does seem to me that, you know, if employee providers see it fit to release their learners for off-the-job training time prematurely, or if at all, then it seems to be counterproductive to the whole exercise in the first place.
Yeah, well, exactly. Why if you're an employer provider and you're running apprenticeships for your own staff, there's no excuse really for not releasing them for their off-the-job training, because it's your own employees. And why would you go down the road of apprenticeships in the first place? You know, and that's an interesting question, because a lot of employers will turn around and say, well, it was to spend our levy. And I've even had employers say to me, well, it was a cheap source of labour to take on young people as apprentices. And of course, they are not the responses you want to hear, and they certainly are not the responses that an Ofsted inspector wants to hear.
Absolutely, and it is unfortunate that in some areas apprenticeships have developed that sort of reputation, which is quite evidently perpetuated by the less reputable employers themselves. You would think, however, that the rules around compliance would deter any of that kind of behavior. Would you not agree, George? Is this prevalent in your experience at all?
I think listening to the comments Richard has just made, which are really pertinent and relevant. For me, I think one of the biggest challenges, I think, is that kind of the sort of almost the beginning to recognize that there's a big difference between quality assurance in terms of delivery as opposed to contract compliance, to the extent that a lot of the time I think the terminology itself has become a problem for employers, because when you look at, say, for example, things such as commitment statements, apprenticeship agreements, and then an iteration of what is expected here in terms of there's things that historically were easy to identify in terms of the learner journey, things such as the induction, the start date. Now you've added in another step, which is about practical start dates, and then you've got gateway, and then you've got off the job. Is it any wonder that sometimes this is now beginning to prove a bit problematic? So depending on what the provider type might be, whether they're a traditional training provider or an employer provider, the approaches are going to be distinctively different. And as a consequence, I think it's beginning to create a real confusion within the sector about what some of these terminologies meant to mean, because although the ESFA have made strides in terms of trying to define what they mean by certain things in terms of their rules, inevitably I see that there might be some kind of overlap or some kind of beginning to misunderstand what the expectation is for an apprenticeship. But increasingly as well, we've had in the last 6 months sort of mutterings from within central government about the potential to revise the rule around the 20% of the job. So given that landscape, I can see why sometimes maybe providers traditionally may sort of look at that as a way out from, you know, not fulfilling their contract obligations. But on the other hand, it is not inconceivable to think that some employers, given the challenges they've faced economically after the pandemic, may also have a different view about the day release system, if at all.
Bally, I know you know the ins and outs of compliance, and I know it's one of your favorite subjects ever. I'm quite eager.
I'm not sure I'd want you to go that far, Vin.
I'm quite eager to get your thoughts on this, because compliance has been, as with the funding rules, as with the landscape overall, I do understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the rules around compliance have changed quite often as well. Am I correct in saying so? If it is, or if it isn't, what are the issues around compliance right now?
I mean, for sure, we I think, you know, this sector, there's two sides to one coin. There's quality, and then there's compliance, and it's all driven by, you know, Department of Education, you know, whether it's Ofsted, whether it's ESFA, and the ESFA generally, we can say generally because it doesn't always happen, they'll write a set of rules, and it's that set of rules that applies to the year, that funding year. However, you can have iterations in that year, so you can have anything from a second, third, sometimes 4 different iterations of that year, so within 1 year, and that in itself causes major issues, major problems for training providers who are grappling with everything that we've mentioned in the past sort of 45 minutes. And on top of that, then there's the paperwork. So, you know, if the evidence trail isn't there to support the activities around learning everything across that learner journey, from you know, recruitment, selection, to initial assessments, to creating the learner plan, doing all your reductions, you know, applying for funding, if you like, or adjusting funding based on the assessments that you've made. All of this matters within the ILR data that goes back to the ESFA. Then, you know, you can see everything that, you know, this, it's so multi-layered, and from a quality and compliance perspective, there's so many different angles on this from an apprenticeship perspective and delivering apprenticeships, that it just becomes confusing. And I think George was inferring and kind of, he sort of mentioned interpretation of rules, and I think that's fundamentally where the problem comes in, that even though we've gone from what was 80 pages of funding rules in the last sort of 5 or 6 years to 140, and I stay very close to the funding rules, sad as that is, but you know, it intrigues me in terms of how prescriptive they have come, and whilst it's intended to be useful, it can also then become very, very rigid and structured, and so much so that, you know, the creativity, you can lose creativity in terms of delivering that product, that particular program of learning to a client, to a apprentice, you know, creatively, if you like. So, you know, we've seen everything from, you know, just lack of paperwork that's been completed, that's been accepted. And we've seen everything through our compliance audits, from just very kind of, you know, low completion or no completion of these sorts of training plans and ILPs, progress reviews perhaps not being done on time, or not being done in a timely fashion. When they are done, they're not signed, they're not, there's no real kind of indication of what's been discussed, you know, and those notes being added to those 12-week reviews. Even sometimes the systems fail you, so there's a potential issue on systems, so there could be multiple systems that providers are running. So for example, one for the ILR, one for the like a learner management system or e-portfolio that we refer to in this sector quite often. There might be other systems that hold specific HR learning, for example, relative to organizations and roles. There's behavioral matrices and information around that, and then you tend to find that all of this ends up in different drives and different places and different people, and people working in silos in this business. I mean, it just creates for a real melting pot of you know, problems, and kind of, you know, the symptoms then start to float to the top, where, you know, you start to find that the providers are sort of chasing their tails, trying to find evidence related to learner files. You know, there's kind of, they're always on the back foot, even training and developing staff around changes in the funding rules. We've seen providers and even individuals within providers interpret funding rules differently to the other person, and then we've seen that play out in documentation, and then across quality and standardization, across learner journey and programs and the way that they're set up against the standards. So it has knock-on effect in multiple areas. So, you know, and that's how you end up then getting sort of, you know, questionable, you know, quality of information and completed documents to support the ILR claim. And obviously, I don't know if you know, Vin, but in this sector, providers will continue to get paid, and at some point an audit or an inspection will happen. And that's, you know, sometimes the point at which, unless quality assurance is really, really robust within an organisation, that, you know, a training provider will really find out, you know, where they effectively, you know, stack up on a quality and a compliance perspective.
I'd imagine that definitely contributes to the complacency which you mentioned earlier, Richard, in regards to the attitudes that these providers have. For example, cheap labour. They may feel that they're completely inundated with a level of bureaucracy, which I'm sure we can all agree is constantly shifting and changing, and it does become overwhelming. I'm wondering what a solution is. If there is one at this point in time, the obvious one would be for them to finally put their feet down and establish longer term compliance for everyone to follow. Another point that you brought up, Richard, was how to devise a personal development curriculum for learners. It's all tied together, but how does one effectively do so in this day and age? There are a lot of issues surrounding apprenticeships in general, and you've noted this down as one of them. Tell us more, please.
Yeah, just to quickly, just before we go there, Vin, just to return to George's point about the sort of the confusion caused by various bits of the process, if you like, stages of the process, sorry, and the ever-changing sort of names of things. And just to very quickly mention skill scans and individual training plans in there, and I think it was either George or Bally who mentioned individual learning plans, training plans. A good individual learning plan or training plan, from my perspective, is about as common as hen's teeth. Most providers either don't have them at all for any of their learners, or if they do, they're all the same, which of course is a bit of an oxymoron when we're talking about something called an individual learning plan. They take no account of some of the changes in funding rules that came into being last year, particularly around the need to identify the off-the-job training that a learner is going to complete in advance of starting their training, or at least to do as much of that as is realistic, because you can't always entirely predict all of the off-the-job training a learner is going to do, particularly if they're going to be doing some of it at work. That's very difficult to plan across a whole 2-year apprenticeship. So individual training plans and learning plans are a bit of a mess from my perspective. I very, very rarely, if ever, see what I would call an effective ILP that is, you know, kind of being used in the way that it should be used with the learners. And allied to that is the problem that a lot of skills scans are still carried out once the learner is enrolled on the programme, rather than being part of the selection procedure. Employers don't receive any feedback from the outcomes of skills scans, which actually is an ESFA rule that they should. There's no discussion with the learners to justify the ratings they give themselves in the skills scans. Providers often copy across the criteria from the standard into the skills scan without understanding that a lot of the learners won't understand the knowledge, skills and behaviour criteria. They won't actually understand what some of the words even mean. And where the learner has already been employed prior to coming onto the apprenticeship, there's often no consultation with the employer as to how they would rate their own employees in terms of their pre-existing knowledge, skills and behaviours. So I just sort of wanted to make those points about skill scans and individual training plans. Do you want me to go on and talk now about personal development just quickly?
Yeah, no, that would be perfect. Thank you.
That's fine. Then we can come back to Bally, who I think perhaps maybe wants to just talk about recruitment of learners. So in terms of personal development, yeah, this is an interesting one. The education inspection framework, in case as anybody has ever wondered, is written for schools. Ofsted never really kind of admit that, but it is. It's completely driven. Every inspection framework is completely driven by the school's agenda. So the reason that we have a key judgment within the education inspection framework, which is titled personal development, is for schools. And if for any part of our sector, probably sixth form colleges and further education colleges, where we all know that the learners have points in the week where they come away from curriculum and they play five-a-side football, they play netball, they do some charity work, they do some community work, they perhaps do enrichment courses that the college offers, they take part in tutorials. So in a college environment, one would expect to see a lot of work going on around personal development. But what the framework kind of forgets is that in our world of apprenticeships, things don't quite work out that way, and employers by and large are not releasing their learners to a training provider for personal development activities. And I don't think there'd be many employers out there who would be very happy to hear that their learners are being released for 6 hours a week to play five-a-side football, netball, and partake in other curriculum enrichment activities. And yet Ofsted are increasingly saying to training providers in the apprenticeship world, can you tell us about your personal development curriculum? And this seems to be a sort of a rub over, if you like, or it's flowed over from the sort of school and college world where that personal development curriculum is often there. It's written out, it's on a sheet of paper. You can actually look at it and see what the learners are going to do each week. And clearly, for a training provider that might only see the learners face-to-face or face-to-face online, let's put it that way, maybe once a month or once every couple of months for an afternoon or a morning, which is quite sort of typical for off-the-job training, how are they then supposed to weave into that very limited time some sort of personal development curriculum? And it's one of the things that Ofsted are being challenged around at the moment. And I think the best that providers or most providers can do is to weave something around topics such as safeguarding, equality, diversity, the so-called British values, which is not a phrase I'm sadly particularly in favour of. That they can sort of weave that into discussions that take place with learners in reviews or in coaching sessions. But whether you could really ever construct a personal development curriculum for learners on an apprenticeship, I think is open to a lot of debate. Of course, what a lot of providers forget is that a lot of learners are getting the personal development type activities with their employer. So particularly for the bigger employers, you know, those sort of well-known brand names in a public sector or private sector, the companies that we've all heard of, they often are putting on personal development activities for their own employees, which of course includes their apprentices. So they do courses on mental health, on well-being, they go on team building days, they go on leadership management courses, and all of that can count towards the learner's personal development as an apprentice, but you wouldn't really call that a personal development curriculum. And I think Ofsted needs to really stand back from this and think about whether it's appropriate to use that sort of terminology in the world of apprenticeships. I'm not saying that the learner's personal development isn't important, of course it is, but it's how you can construct a curriculum in our world around it, which I think is the more contentious point.
Understood. George, what are your thoughts on that, so on the personal development curriculum?
Yeah, it's a very interesting, observation from what Richard has been saying, but it is actually inherently apparent to those of us within the industry practitioners that the issue of personal development plan, as Richard rightly says, isn't really, is something that can be seen as a bolt-on, very much so, because whenever you audit anything to what might be almost described as personal development, you invariably always find that it is almost prescriptive to the extent that the training provider and the employer really pretty much predetermine how the world for the learner is going to look like, and it really doesn't really bear much resemblance to what the individual might actually be thinking for themselves and where they want to be, say 5-10 years time. And as a consequence, I totally agree with Richard's way of thinking that, it needs to be rethought in the context of work-based learning as opposed to the curriculum that was first sort of thought out in terms of how Ofsted have always approached, to the extent that sometimes even in the actual writings that they put in the reports, it still talks about the learner and student in that context, as opposed to, an employee who's actually in work, but who also has aspirations beyond the qualification and potentially what their employer might be thinking for them at that point in time.
I completely agree. And I mean, what is a personal development curriculum for a 55-year-old learner in a senior leadership role on a level 5 or 6 apprenticeship? I mean, what is the notion of a personal development curriculum for that type of person, sorry, and that's a very different animal to a personal development curriculum for a 16-year-old doing A levels in a sixth form college.
Completely agree with all your sentiments there, Richard, and yours, George. Bally, is there any aspect of that you'd like to elaborate on, or agree with, or disagree with?
I completely agree with both of my colleagues on that note. I was making notes frantically, and you know, I'm a mother of a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old, and I look at them and I would love them to do apprenticeships. But you know, the 21st century learner, the kids of today, if you like, if you take the younger learners, that cohort, you know, they're looking for fast pace, they're looking for you know, peer-to-peer development opportunities, they're looking for digital to enhance their digital capability, their skills, they're looking for rotation, they're looking for extracurricular challenges, all of the above, and sometimes I feel that we can't actually deliver that in such a prescribed system of what we've created, or what's being created for us to deliver apprenticeships within, is this environment of apprenticeships with all the rules, regulations that come with it. So yeah, nothing but agreement with my colleagues here. I think on a final point, I just wanted to note, if I may, if I've got just a couple of minutes, just to mention about this whole aspect of recruiting learners and the young learner, if you like, and how difficult it is becoming really for apprenticeship training providers, we're finding of late. And I think it's again related to everything we've mentioned, the kind of current conditions, cost of living, the transient nature at the minute of the workforce, that no sooner are they in a job if they get an offer by another you know, organisation, and the benefits are seemingly higher, they're very quick to move. And whilst the apprenticeship is portable for that learner, and they can move to a different organisation, employer, it just makes it very difficult for apprenticeship training providers to then reassign that to another provider, if you like, and they end up potentially losing the funding in terms of how far they've got with that learner. And that in itself also is creating, we're seeing a lot more of that coming through at the moment. Probably one for another day to discuss in a bit more detail, but again, I just wanted to mention that relative to the learners and relative to the environment. Don't know if my colleagues want to mention that and add anything to that for now, but yeah, recruitment of learners is definitely one that's a bit of a struggle.
And I think it's recruitment of learners who are on what I would call a genuine apprenticeship, where they're learning a job role from scratch. And 10 years ago on inspection, I'd have been amazed to meet an apprentice aged over 18, and they would all have been on level 2 apprenticeships with a few on level 3. Now I'm amazed to meet learners aged under 18 on a level 2 apprenticeship, because they don't really seem to exist anymore. I think they do in colleges. They don't seem to exist very much in training providers. And I wonder how far the sort of change in the recruitment profile is moving us away from people really learning a job, you know, from scratch. What kind of the original definition of an apprenticeship? And it concerns me that a lot of older learners on higher level apprenticeships, whether they really are apprentices or not. Some of them are, but I'm not sure whether all of them are.
I see. And George, let's finish off with your thoughts. The recruitment of learners, where are the issues, do you think?
I think for me, it's kind of the interesting thing around what Richard has just mentioned around adult, what we traditionally considered adult learners, i.e. 19 plus, and then the under 19s, is that increasingly we begin to see a trend of where organizations, say, for example, are recruiting with an expectation that they want to almost reflect certain factors beyond just succession planning, in terms of, say, for example, the composition of their workforce being more diverse. And that in itself sometimes creates challenges in terms of recruitment, because if, say, for example, an organization is looking to, is conscious of the fact that their profile of learners are predominantly, say, for example, one ethnic grouping, for example, and they're trying to sort of incorporate an essence of diversity, that in itself, that becomes to some extent discriminatory, that the learners who may necessarily be the right candidates for that proposition are not really getting access to that position because there is a thinking behind the recruitment process which is intended to almost narrow the gap in terms of the profile of employee that that organization is really intentionally targeting, whether positively or consciously, in a manner that addresses some of the challenges businesses face today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bally and George and Richard. To summarize, we've gone through the different topics which all three have come up with in regards to the challenges of apprenticeships, and what we'll be doing moving forward in a series of podcasts is delving into each of these topics at length. We'll be bringing these three back to offer their expertise and the breadth, depth of their knowledge further. So we'll leave it there. Bally, George and Richard, thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts again. Before we finish, however, do we have any final thoughts moving forward?
I think from my point of view, it's a case of sometimes when we have these discussions amongst ourselves, people who are directly involved in the sector, I think we almost unconsciously fail to recognize that there's an audience out there which is interested in the world of apprenticeships, but the amount of jargon that we kind of routinely roll off our tongues can be quite baffling to the extent that, you know, my other half sometimes will kind of overhear some of the conversations that go on between myself and Bally and sort of says, what the hell were you talking about? Because we seem to talk about things which actually relate to real life in terms of impacting on a lot of people around ourselves. But the industry has kind of evolved to become almost a dark art. And I hope that in sort of future kind of recordings, we will be able to humanize some of the dialogue that we have, which is really trying to make it open up to the different audiences in terms of if I was listening to this and I'm, say, for example, a young person who is under the age of 16 and I've heard about apprenticeships, I would like to be in a position where I can sort of have a sense that I can go and listen to a podcast of so-called specialists, or if you like, people who know something about apprenticeships, and come out thinking that I actually understood what they've been talking about. Obviously, that's kind of a whimsical way of thinking from my part, but I'm sort of thinking that I would like to think that if we can sort of try and attach that context to the dialogue that we have so that it doesn't become overly, if you like, not academic, but too bureaucratic, if you like.
Understood. I would hope that also that after these series of podcasts, no one will be in position to question what the hell any of us are talking about. Bally, any final thoughts before we finish?
Yeah, I'll just add to what George has just said, and I was thinking the same thing, but from new training providers' perspective, we work a lot with new training providers to guide them through this sector. Just that initial advice around, you know, how do you get into this sector? This is what we do. What is the process? And just understanding it is a minefield. Sometimes when I sort of mention the process of what you need to do and the various hoops that you need to jump through, that can become very kind of disheartening very quickly for new potential providers and entry into the marketplace. So I think, you know, if we can dedicate a podcast, perhaps in the future at some point, you know, to, again, going back to George's words, just to humanize the dialogue, just even for them, that would be useful. But I'm pretty certain it'll be equally applicable to existing and incumbent providers as well.
Richard, are you on board with us? Will you enable us to humanize this sector at all?
Yeah, I would agree with both those points. And I think one of the things that, you know, concerns me about the jargon is you lose sight of fundamentally what this is all about. And that is taking somebody who is completely new to a sector or job role, or perhaps already has a little bit of experience, and you're trying to turn them into a fabulous employee. And I often used to find on inspection that when we couldn't decide how to grade a provider because we were lost in the jargon and the off-the-job hours, and had they done reviews, and had we talked about safeguarding, yada, 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 that I would often go around the team at the end of the inspection when we was kind of split in our views, and I just go around each member of the team and I would say to them, in your experience of what you've seen this week, is this training provider turning these apprentices into fantastic employees who are so much more employable than they were when they started? And if I went around the room and 7 out of the 10 inspectors said yes, then we gave them a good grade. Because when you strip it all away, that is actually what an apprenticeship is all about. And if we think back to those old Pathé News black and white sort of videos in the 1930s, BBC, with a sort of very posh commentator, and people were doing apprenticeships in furniture making and shipbuilding and you know, road maintenance, whatever it might be. We didn't have skill scans or individual learning plans or progress reviews, things like that. And yet these people, a lot of these people went on to be brilliant technicians and experts in their field. So I think it's very easy to lose sight of really actually what an apprenticeship is all about. And I think it's very easy for providers to lose sight of that.
Well, and with that wisdom, we'll end it there. Let's hope the next few podcasts, at the very least, will address some of those issues and look into some solutions. Please join us for the next one. Thank you for your time. Thank you once more from Bally, George and Richard. And thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.